Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do yet another Herstoryathon video. Herstoryathon, if you haven't heard by now, is the March read-along, or readathon I should say, that is hosted by myself and Brittany over at Literarily Smitten, where we are celebrating Women's History Month and challenging you to read at least one book that is about a woman of the past. It can be fiction, it can be non-fiction, but we're just very keen to have as many people as possible celebrating with us. And something that I started doing last year and I wanted to bring back is going through all of the books that I read that were to do with women's history that I read since last Herstoryathon, so basically from April 2023 up to now, because reading about fantastic women of the past is not just confined to 1 month. I will say though, my non-fiction reading especially has taken a little bit of a nosedive, so I feel like there aren't quite as many books to talk about today, but still some pretty great ones. I would recommend almost all of these books, but there is one right at the end which I don't love, and you will have learned that I don't love very recently. But without much further ado, let's just get into some of these books. I'm going to do it in chronological order, so the first book that I read following Herstoryathon of 2023 is Woman's Law by Sarah Clegg. 4,000 Years of Sirens, Serpents and Succubi. Sarah Clegg's history of basically the demonic woman, starting with some detailed chapters about Lilith, who according to Jewish tradition was the first wife of Adam, who then became a demon, as opposed to the more heavenly Eve. This book is really interesting, tracing not only how we've come to think about these she-demons and demonic women generally, but also what history has been afraid of when it comes to just human women, the kind of traits that society does not want women to possess, and the kind of traits that they want to put upon other women and make them fear. There are a lot of instances of women praying to these kind of demonic women in order to appease them, and a lot of these fears are centered around like childbirth and child rearing and wanting to keep their children away from these she-demons. And it's interesting to think about how this reflects in modern society. Fears around childless women. What is a woman if she doesn't have children? Oh, behold the she-demon. This was really fascinating history, and definitely something I'd love to learn more about. Next up we have Hidden Hands by Mary Wellersley, the lives of manuscripts and their makers. So technically this could count as not being Herstoryathon because there are obviously other people other than women who are engaged with manuscripts. But I think this is interesting when it comes to women's history, because when it comes to especially medieval writing, I think people don't necessarily think of women. Through this book, Mary Wellersley is going through the creation of different manuscripts and how often it is women who were the ones transcribing and copying manuscripts, and the evidence for it can often be in marginalia, as well as those women who are charged to preserve and keep those manuscripts intact. And it's interesting to see how much knowledge we would be missing if it wasn't for that careful preservation. I don't know necessarily how much is transferable if you're not particularly interested in literary histories, but I definitely found it very cool. Next up is Uncrowned Queen, The Fateful Life of Margaret Beaufort by Nicola Tallis. This is a history that I have had on my shelf since I think 2020, summer 2020, and I've been really keen to read, so I can't believe it's taken me this long. But no, the history of Margaret Beaufort, who was famously the mother of Henry VII, who would go on to win the Battle of Bosworth and be the first king of the Tudor line. Margaret Beaufort, I would say, is one of the more better known women from this time period, but often gets a bit of a bad rap, kind of criticised for being too pushy, too manipulative, too ambitious. There are even some claims that she was the one who murdered the princes in the Tower in order to forward her son's ambitions. Still not heard a satisfactory response for how she would have had access to the princes in the Tower, to be honest. Definitely not one that usurped Richard, but I digress. She's often depicted quite negatively in film and TV. I'm particularly thinking of The White Princess, which once again goes down the track of Margaret Beaufort being the murderer of the princes. Philippa Gregory, I'm looking at you. Bombastic side eye. But no, I have a lot of sympathy for her, especially knowing her childhood, or lack of a childhood I should say, having given birth to Henry Tudor when she was 13 years old. This was her second husband, and he was dead by the time his son was born. Like, how lonely and isolating that must have been. How terrifying it must have been. Having her son sent into exile because he was in danger for his life because of his claims to the throne. So you know what? When he was finally safe and he was securely on the throne, I'm not surprised that she glomped onto him and maybe wanted to be a little bit pushy and proud of her son. But I feel like Nicola Tallis was able to create a really sympathetic portrayal. And you know, even saying everything that I am saying, I don't think that she is a perfect person by any means. But I feel like treacherous, manipulative, even so much as saying that she was a bad mother-in-law to Elizabeth of York. I even think that's not very fair. And I feel like Nicola Tallis portrays her in a pretty well-rounded way. Next up is Game of Queens by Sarah Gristwood, which is a long sweeping history of the different prominent women around Europe during the 16th century. From Catherine of Aragon Aragon to Mary Queen of Scots, a book that is pretty much tailor-made for me, and I do really enjoy Sarah Gristwood's writing. If anything, I feel like I'd want to reread this one because I feel like I read it in a bit of a blur, but I always love going back to these figures, and particularly going over some of the queens that I didn't know quite as much about. Louise of Savoy and Anne de Beaujeu, particularly, I didn't know very much about. I feel like I read this in a bit of a summer haze. So I was taking in a lot about the queens that I already knew, you know, any of the six wives, Elizabeth, Catherine de Medici, but I think it is really an interesting history to think about this time, having so many prominent women right in the forefront of politics. Just this little spark that then wasn't seen for centuries, and really great to see how they interacted with each other and how they impacted on each other. Next up is The Lonely Empress by Joan Haslip, which is a history of Elizabeth of Austria. Once again, a book that has been on my life TBR, one that I've always wanted to read because I find her life fascinating but incredibly tragic as well. This kind of it girl of Austria who is still to this day adored. If you go to Austria, you can actually find Empress CC merchandise. Honestly, I want to go to Austria just for that. Just to pick up a little mug that has Empress CC on it. But for how loved and adored she was incredibly confined, particularly by her mother-in-law. The position that she was in, by mental health problems, particularly to do with her appearance. She had anorexia, wanted everything about her appearance to look pristine and precise, would spend hours every day just on her hair, her beautiful, beautiful hair, it has to be said. But then especially towards the end of her life, so much tragedy, particularly with one of her sons, and the way that she died. Just somebody who was really in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yeah, it was great to get a little bit more insight into her, but my goodness, what a tragic life. I definitely would love to get any more recommendations that you may have. Disobedient by Elizabeth Freemantle is historical fiction looking at the life of Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a painter in the early 17th century, known for depicting quite gruesome scenes. Growing up in a very male household, being taught how to paint by her father, which you would think would give her a lot of freedoms that a lot of women wouldn't have. But we see through this book how she is still very, very much restricted by her status as a woman, and you feel very claustrophobic through this book. Despite the fact that she is taught how to paint, she is not taught how to read, and that adds its own limitations on her. And particularly this book looks at her early life and the consequences of her father bringing a fellow painter into their home, Tassie, who would subsequently rape Artemisia, renege on his promise of marrying her afterwards, and the excruciating court battle that she had to go through, which included her being tortured in order to prove her innocence and the veracity of her testimony. And it is horrifying, but so well told. I could feel Artemisia's anger and her frustration through the page, and I felt it just as she did, right alongside her. It's a book that I feel like I've not heard a lot of people talking about, but is wonderfully evocative and definitely worth more consideration than it's had. Not long after that, I read Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue, a book that I feel was kind of written for me. You know, we have Emma Donoghue, who is one of my favourite writers, writing about Anne Lister, one of my favourite historical figures because she is an icon of my hometown. Anne Lister, Regency landowner of Shibden Hall in Halifax, who came back into prominence, I want to say, in the 1980s upon the transcribing of her diaries, her many, many diaries. I think it's around about 5 million words, which she kept from being a teenager up until her death, but were mostly written in this very ornate, hard to crack code. But when it was decoded, revealed a lot of her exploits, particularly sexual exploits with other women. And so Anne Lister has since been dubbed the first modern lesbian. But this book is not looking at the time that most people think of her when she has come into her property and is travelling around the world, but actually looks at her school days as a boarding student in York and her relationship with her first love, Eliza Rain. The majority of the book is actually from Eliza's perspective, and as a result we're kind of getting to see Anne from the outside, how she kind of barrels into the school and has this larger than life personality, an enormous amount of confidence for a teenager, but which quickly kind of clashes with the school and the orthodoxy that they're trying to put on these children. Also knowing how Anne would subsequently end up treating Eliza, you're seeing how Eliza would fall in love with her, how she would be mesmerised by her, but also we're seeing how Anne is capable of cruelty and being quite dismissive of other people's feelings. So it's a complex depiction that Emma Donoghue is able to create of Anne, but for me felt very true. I've always said that Anne Lister is somebody who I think is such an icon, who I admire, but I would hate to actually meet in person. I don't think we would get on, because while she is fascinating, I don't necessarily think she's always the best person, and I feel like Emma Donoghue was able to capture that very, very well. Next book is non-fiction, and it is Harlots, Whores and Hackabouts by Kate Lister, a history of sex for sale. This is published by Thames and Hudson and is this beautiful, I want to say it is an art book, part history, part art book, because Kate Lister infuses this story with so many illustrations, photographs, just different image clippings of the experiences of sex workers throughout history. While Kate Lister's writing is always funny and very witty, I feel like it is really the images that you are coming to this book for. And friendly note to some, don't read this on the bus, as I accidentally did. This was the last book that I had to finish off my TBR back in September, and I just forgot. I was so keen to keep reading that I forgot that this looks a little bit dodgy in front of other people. But a fantastic history, just fantastic wealth of material that Kate Lister has been able to collate, and a fascinating look at women who we do not always get the perspectives of and who people tend to dismiss. Penultimate book from this past year is Elizabeth Gaskell, a biography by Jenny Uglow. This is one that I actually picked up after going to Manchester and going to the Elizabeth Gaskell house. I was very keen to learn more about her because even though I have read I think 5 of her works, I didn't really know much about her life, and Jenny Uglow has really gone into detail, not just about her life but also her works and how they inform her as a person. And I feel like that is the bit that kind of makes this a little less readable as a biography, because even though, yes, of course, you would expect that the books that somebody publishes would say something about their lives and would have an impact on their lives especially, there are moments where she's talking about these books that it does feel more like book essays than it does a flowing biography. What I loved about Jenny Uglow's portrayal of Elizabeth, what it really managed to highlight for me about her, is how much Elizabeth Gaskell just really loved people. She loved getting to know people. She was very outgoing, very extroverted, and so it's really nice to then go to some of her works and just kind of see that in play with her character design. You can very much imagine she's fashioning these people out of people she may know because she just loves humans so much. She has a wealth of knowledge and past experiences to draw upon. And I don't know, I feel like it was a surprise to me because I often imagine authors to kind of be like me and be a little bit more introverted, you know, to be very, very quiet and unassuming, which for one thing, I work in publicity, I work with authors, I know that that's not true. And also, once again, if you are going to write characters, you kind of need to know what people are like. You need to have an interest in people to write characters effectively. I think that's what Elizabeth Gaskell is able to do. So lesson learned for me. And then the final book to talk to you about today, the final book that I read between April of last year and March of this year, is Mary or the Birth of Frankenstein by Anne Eekhout. My review video for this book will have gone up and you will know I didn't like it. So this book is following Mary Shelley in 2 separate timelines, one in 1812 where she's been sent to live with the Baxter family near Dundee and ends up having an increasingly intense, fraught relationship with the elder daughter Isabella. And then we're also flashing occasionally to 1816 in Geneva where she, Percy Shelley, John Polidori, Lord Byron and Claire Clairmont are staying, and famously where Lord Byron challenged the writers among them to write a ghost story, which would then lead to the writing of Frankenstein. And yeah, in short, I didn't see how these two plot lines really coalesced and came together, at least not the way that Anne Eekhout wrote them. You know, the main connecting thread is obviously Mary Shelley, but I feel like that's not good enough. There is no reason for them to be set up as they are. The Isabella Baxter chapters just felt like fan fiction and just didn't add anything, and also it just generally felt like misadvertising, calling it The Birth of Frankenstein when we barely talk about Frankenstein at all. Her writing it is not really included at all in those 1816 chapters. We're just kind of seeing her wandering aimlessly, not knowing what to write about, and it just felt for me like a bit of a missed opportunity. But as I say, more thoughts in that video, which I will link down below. So there we go. There weren't very many books that I read that were to do with women's history, which is a bit disappointing, but I feel like it was a good group of books. I'm definitely keen to hear anything that you've read recently that would fit for this. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.